I'm about 10 videos deep in today, and I promised myself that if I kept going, I could do a fly that was sort of involved in a little bit more fun. And what I'm going to tie for you is a standard Adams. And I know that's not incredibly creative, but the Adams is sort of what, or the pattern anyway, is sort of what so many Catskill style dries are sort of based off of. So I'm going to tie you one the way I tie it, and I'll kind of walk you through what I do as I do that. So I've got a standard dry fly hook here. This is a Tiemco 100 SPBL, and I've got some 14-aught Vivus in black. And I'm going to start this thread, maybe 60% of the hook, 60% point, and I'm going to wrap back over it to the bend. Now, a lot of guys like to put the tail or put the wings in before the tail, but I'm not one of those guys, so I'm going to tie the tail in first. And I've got a couple tricks for the tail. What I want to use, this is a spade feather from a brown rooster cape. It's on the outside edge of the cape. Let me grab this cape. This is a high-end dry cape from Whiting, which is their less expensive capes, but let me get you zoomed out here. Well, you don't want to grab it, but it's on the outside edge, the widest part of the cape, and they're these sort of oddly shaped feathers on the sides. They are called spade hackles because back in the day before genetics got so crazy, these feathers were much more spade shaped, kind of wide. And what I'm looking for is a feather. Let me just peel one out of here. That has these long, stiff barbs, no web on them. And what I've done is I've kind of pulled all the fluff off the bottom end and just sort of stroke those fibers back against the grain so that they stand out from the stem. Now I can get maybe a dozen flies out of this little piece here. So you can see how a lot of bang for the buck on this. So I'm going to take 6 or 8 brown fibers, and my thread's hanging at the bend, and I'm just going to catch those and lay them in like so. Don't worry about the length just yet. Then I'm going to pick up my grizzly spade, which I've treated the same way. Kind of stroke those fibers out of the way, and I'll get 6 or 8 grizzly fibers. I'm going to take these and lay these in so that they're the same length as the brown. Once I've got them there, then I can undo that turn of brown. So I just use the thread wrap to hold those while I stack the two. Now I'm going to tie it in so it's a shank length long. And I'm going to come forward over these butt ends, just short of where my thread started, just short of that 60% point, and I want to cut those butt ends off there. Now I'll bring my thread all the way up to the hook eye and back to the 87.5% point. And I know that sounds like a weird measurement, but what that is that's going to be the middle of the front quarter of the hook. So if we divide this hook into fourths, the front quarter, we're going to be in the middle of that, and that's where we want to put our wings. If you think of the abdomen, the dubbed body of the fly taking up about 75% of the hook, and then the hackle taking up about 25% of the hook, we want the wings in the middle of that front quarter. So I'm going to leave my thread hanging there, and then I'm going to pick out, off of a grizzly hen cape, 2 feathers that are about the same size and shape. They're usually right next to each other. And what I'm looking for are feathers that have nice rounded tips like those. You don't want pointy rooster hackle tips. You want rounded hen hackle tips for this. And they're about as wide, if I hold them real steady here, about as wide as the gap of the hook. So these feathers are as they came off the hide. I'm going to oppose these like you might oppose the tails on a prince nymph. So I've got to put those feathers so that they're back to back and curving away from each other. I'm just using the natural curve. Let me get a better hold on these so you can see them. The natural curve of the feather to separate the two. And then I can kind of move my fingertips back and forth to where I get the 2 tips even. Once I've got the tips even, I'm going to bump my thread back just a touch here. I'm going to measure these a whole hook length long. So a hook length goes from the hook eye all the way back here to the bend. Ultimately, I want these wings to stand up 1 shank length tall. But if I cut them to exactly a shank length tall, when I go to tie them in, something's going to be attached to the hook, and those wings are going to come out a little short. So I want to leave myself a little extra room, and I'm using my thumbnail here on my near side to measure that point. And I'll transfer those to my thread hand and cut them off at that length. So what you're looking at now, pull those loose fibers out, what you're looking at now is the butt end of those two feather tips. Now my thread's hanging at 87.5%. I'm going to pinch these two feathers down onto the hook shank. So I've got the hook shank, the feathers, everything pinched in my fingers. You can see I'm moving everything around there. And this is just like the standard pinch wrap that you do, but this is a reverse pinch. So I'm going to work the thread with my material hand and come up and do a pinch wrap and snap it down. Get another one on there before I let go. Okay, might even sneak one more in there because we're on video. Now you can come in, and this is the time to do it when you've just got a few turns on there, and take another hook of the same size and style that you're tying on and measure that and see if that is a shank length long. And it is. Looking pretty good. Put that hook away. Now, I just usually make just a couple turns over those butt ends, and I'm going to close my fingers under the vise and sweep them up and back to pull those wings back, and I want to build just a little thread dam. These feathers are soft. It doesn't take a lot. This is not like doing a hair wing, but just a little thread dam at their front edge to stand them upright so that they're at 90 degrees to the hook shank. Then I just use my scissor tips to separate those two wings. You can kind of push down between them. You can even use your finger to sort of flay them back a little bit to where they're separated. And you can see there's usually a few right here, these little fibers. Those get buried in the hackle collar, but I usually do trim them out of the way. Just so that I don't have to compete with them. And what we're looking for are wings that look like that. Get your focus just right and hold them just right. Now, I don't take any X-wraps or anything extraneous there. I just count on the natural curve of the feathers to hold those two fibers apart. Now I'm going to bring my thread back and I'm going to cover those butt ends on my way. I didn't need to do that as a separate step because I was going to get there anyway. Now, if you were tying a blue dun, you would have used blue dun hackle fibers for the tail and blue dun hackle tips for the wings. And from there, you could use any variety of different dubbing colors to make, what is known as a Catskill style dry. And that's what we're doing here. So this Adams, and this is not the original Adams. The original Adams had a golden pheasant tippet tail, but that doesn't really go along with this fly. This is the sort of modern, if that's even possible, version of an Adams. To that note, the body on this should be made of muskrat fur. I'm going to use gray superfine dubbing because it's just better. It dubs down tighter and nicer, and I like it better. I do have some muskrat fur right here in my drawer to my left, but I like superfine. So I'm going to dub that on nice and tight. I'm going to use my bare thread between the dubbing and the hook to work my thread back so that I get my first turn of dubbing back here at the base of the tail. Then I'm going to work forward, and I want to build a tapered body, and I can kind of take a turn forward and a turn back, turn forward and turn back, and kind of run those a little closer together as I get closer to the wings. I'm going to tighten that last turn up just so I have a nice shoulder there. Yeah, about like that. Now, one of the things you want to keep in mind on a fly like this, on any variety of flies like this, is we're going to put a hackle collar on here. So we want equal distance from really my index point, which is just, in my case, about a half an eye length behind the hook eye, from the wings to the index point and the wings to the front edge of the body. If I hold that on that side, those two distances should be the same because we've got to leave room for our hackle that we're going to put in here. So now I've got a brown and a grizzly feather, and hopefully these are going to be the same size. I tried to do a decent job with this before I started the camera. I think I'm all right. Yeah. So I'm going to take these two feathers and trim the butt ends out. And I've got these stacked inside to outside. My grizzly feather's on top. It really doesn't matter which feather's on top. But what I want to do is I want to strip some bare stem that's equal to about, I'm going to say 35%, 35% of the hook shank. If that area we've got reserved at the front is 25%, I want just a touch longer than that. So I've stripped the butt ends of both those feathers. My thread's hanging at the front edge of the body. And I'm going to lay this in with those stub ends just behind the hook eye. And I'll anchor these in place as I come forward, right up to the back of the wings. Then I'll come around in front. I'm a little close to the eye. I can trim those stubs just slightly shorter. Then I'll continue right up. So I just tied those stems. That kept our base for our hackle as even as possible there. Got a little glare on there. I was just getting that out. Now, you got a couple choices here. You can wrap one feather at a time, and when you go with your first feather, leave a few spaces for the second feather. But I find that I can get a much more densely hackled collar if I wrap these feathers both at the same time. So I'm going to pick these up and start right at the front edge of the body and start wrapping forward. Now, as you're wrapping, if your feathers start to separate, you're holding the feathers too far away from the hook. See how my fingers are right up close? I'm going to wrap right up to the back of the wings. So I'm holding these as close to the hook as I can. When I get to the wings, I'm just going to sweep them back, and much like that thread dam, I'm going to put that next turn right up against the front edge, and then one more. So what I got there was 3 turns behind and 2 in front, and that's totally okay. I'm going to tie this off. I'll talk more about that once I get this tied off. I usually shoot for between plus or minus 1 turn. So 3 behind and 2 in front is really, exactly what I shoot for. That just happened to come out exactly right because I practiced. But that's what I'm looking for is 3 turns of hackle behind the wings and 2 in front. We've got a little extra room reserved for our thread head. And see how upright those hackle wraps are? Those high and dry feathers actually wrap really nicely. I'm surprised. Jake sent me a couple of those capes to play with, and they're beautiful. I got no complaint. So I'm going to trim those feathers out, and I'm just going to, if you guys look close there, you can see there's just a little stub of that hackle where I trimmed it off. I'm going to use my thread to cover that up, and this is just enough of a thread head to cover that and clean that thread head up a bit. Got a weird fiber there. Oh, looking pretty good now. Pretty good. And then I'll come in and whip finish him after I find my whip finisher under my dubbing and my hen cape. Now, I'm sure somebody out there in the world is going to say, that's not how an Adams was tied, blah, blah, blah. Why don't you do it this way? Why don't you do it that way? There's a lot of reasons why I don't do it other ways. This is the way that I've always done them. And, that darn thing came out pretty darn nice, so I got no complaints there. You can see my wings are about 45 to each other. If I turn this and hold them just right for you, about 45 degrees. Let's see here. Come back in focus. There you go. About 45 degrees to each other, and they're flat next to each other. There's no twist or turn. We don't have any wings offset. It's a pretty clean little Adams. That, just for the record, if you're ever on Charlie Craven Jeopardy, is the first fly I ever caught a fish on. I don't know, I was probably 9 years old. Went with my cousin Danny and left me alone on a little creek while he went and fished downstream, so I didn't bug him. And I was fishing this along, and I have no idea how, but somehow a fish managed to be attached to it. And so it's kind of always had a soft spot for me. We will put a little shot of head cement on here. I like to use, on a little fly like this, just the applicator tube, or the needle that goes in the applicator tube, just to put that little drop just on the thread head, trying to keep it out of the hook eye. Not goop up the hackle too much. You've got to be careful when, if you're using the main tube out of the head cement bottle, if you get too big a drop, it will wick into the base of those hen wings. They're pretty porous, so you got to be a little careful with that. But that, let's take a little more of that glare off. Go this way. There we go. A little more like it. Sorry about that. I hadn't adjusted that before I started from the last slide. But there's our atoms. That's a pretty standard pattern. That's you can see how you could change the color of the tail and the hackle, the wings, and of course the dubbing and thread, and make any variety of flies that have this same silhouette, but with all the same techniques. So pretty crafty way to go about it, and obviously so many of those flies are just variations of this. But once you start to recognize what things are a variation of, it makes things a lot easier. Once you know how to tie an Adams, you know how to tie a lot of other stuff. So there you go. That is the standard Adams, and I am still Charlie Craven. I bet I'll be Charlie Craven tomorrow, too. Keep your fingers crossed. You guys, thanks for watching. Take care.